It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Nall, who's going to be speaking with us today about lessons of the Iraq War. Come on.
Some would have us believe that the failure of the peace movement to prevent the 2003 Iraq War negates that movement's value or importance, that it was an obvious failure, that it was a meaningless effort, that it was a waste of time. Such a view evidences a troublingly impoverished moral imagination and an absurdly narrow conception of the human condition, something that, as a humanities professor today, I have to say I think the humanities has a lot to offer us to reconsider and more fully understand. The peace movement of 2002 and 2003 and beyond rekindled and ignited the ethical and political conscience of millions of people around the world and in this country, and it became a catalyst for activism in a number of domains related to, but also in many ways distinct from that Iraq War. And the movement, perhaps most importantly, also exemplified the best of humanity. And if we look closely, this movement teaches us to value what is intrinsically good. More on that in a minute. Now, if we step back 20 years ago, March 20th, 2003, hours before daybreak, President and Commander-in-Chief George Bush launched a massive aerial assault on Iraq's capital city, Baghdad. The Bush administration's military aim was to decapitate Iraq's leadership. The shock and awe bombardment came to a grim and cacophonous crescendo on March 21st. An IT news reporter in Iraq described it this way, quote, "Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth, an inferno. This isn't just an attack on bricks and mortar, it is an assault on human senses," end quote. The United States and its coalition forces captured Iraq's capital in less than a month. On May 1st, you may recall, 2003, President Bush stood in front of a mission accomplished banner and proclaimed an end to major combat operations. The Bush administration insisted that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMD, and that a preemptive invasion was necessary to prevent Saddam Hussein from using those weapons to hurt the United States and to hurt its allies. On January 29, 2002, just 4 months after the September 11th attacks, President Bush delivered his infamous State of the Union speech where he warned the nation of a menacing axis of evil that included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. A traumatized and fearful nation listened as our president stated, quote, "By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred," end quote. Bush explained that Iraq was hostile to the United States, supported terrorism, and continued plotting to, quote, "develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons," end quote. But let us not forget that it was before that time, July 31st, that Senator Joe Biden used his position as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to insist that Iraq did have WMD. He said, and I quote, "These weapons must be dislodged from Saddam Hussein, or Saddam Hussein must be dislodged from power." President Bush has stated his determination to remove Saddam from power, a view many in Congress share, end quote. So, on October 11, 2002, 48 Republicans voted for the unambiguously named resolution, the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution of 2002. And they were joined by 28 Senate Democrats, including Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Dianne Feinstein, John Kerry, and Chuck Schumer. Biden later co-sponsored the resolution commending Bush's invasion, putting an exclamation mark on that invasion. Of course, Iraq did not have WMD, In October 2004, post-invasion inspectors tasked with locating those weapons determined that Iraq ceased its production of such weapons in 1991. In other words, Iraq had given up their WMDs 12 years before the U.S. invaded Iraq to ostensibly eliminate that program. The Bush administration and leading figures in both parties, including our now President Joe Biden and, of course, Mitch McConnell, were dead wrong. U.S. leaders' decision to invade Iraq caused the deaths of more than 4,400 U.S. soldiers. Another 32,000 soldiers of our country were physically wounded. The people allotted the greatest share of suffering, of trauma, of destruction, of death were, of course, the people who were given absolutely no say in launching the war, the Iraqi people. Between March 20th, 2003 and the end of 2011, a total of 280,000 Iraqi civilians killed directly from that Iraq war. For perspective, this is a figure nearly 17 times greater than the little city I live in called Vero Beach. The civilian death toll in Iraq is greater than the population of one of the fastest growing cities in the state of Florida, Port St. Lucie, which has just over 217,000 residents. Now, this war was not launched by politicians alone. In October 2002, most of the people in the United States believed Saddam Hussein was close to having nuclear weapons. Nearly a sixth of the nation believed he already had them. A majority, 66% as of 2002 and 57% in 2003, mistakenly believed that Saddam Hussein had a role in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And this sentiment was actually very directly expressed by a pro-war demonstrator here in Melbourne, Florida, on February 15, 2003, who carried a sign reading, "Remember 9/11 and let the bombs fall." And fall they did. After more than a year of hearing those in power of both parties warn of Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism, for WMD, and the desire to harm the U.S. and its allies, 66% of the population favored military action in Iraq 1 month prior to the invasion. In 2002, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who these days is welcomed on mainstream airwaves to share her expert opinion, told CNN's Wolf Blitzer, quote, "There will always be some uncertainty about how quickly Saddam Hussein can acquire nuclear weapons, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud," end quote. Much better for the mushroom clouds, for the smoking guns to occur over Baghdad and at the expense of the lives of the Iraqi people. The public's obsequious embrace of the Bush administration's talking points was facilitated by the widespread failures of journalists in the mainstream media. Major news outlets frequently echoed and amplified the administration's WMD claims without subjecting them to an iota of meaningful scrutiny. I remember at the time actually talking to a friend of mine, 2003, I was living here in Palm Bay, about how shocking it was that the government wanted us to go to war with Iraq. And to my surprise, my friend viewed military action as a kind of necessary evil. This was a younger guy of my age and in our early 20s who was absolutely no fan of President Bush, but said that we couldn't dismiss the threat of WMD. I pointed out that our government had not proven Iraq had such weapons, and that we couldn't just let the Bush administration send our country to war so haphazardly. He rebutted with a mixture of agitation and fear. What did I know, he asked. What could any of us know? We weren't the ones with access to the important papers, to the intelligence reports. We needed to trust those who did, those in power. We needed to trust our president. But not everyone was convinced of the Bush administration's claims that Saddam Hussein had WMD or that invading Iraq was the right decision. The preemptive peace movement of 2002 through early 2003, along with independent thinking elected officials who question the rationale of the Iraq War, offer us a very valuable lesson in the virtues of critical thinking and what it looks like to be a true participant in a democratic society. In the House of Representatives, independent Bernie Sanders joined with 126 Democrats, including Barbara Lee, Dennis Kucinich, and 6 Republicans, including Ron Paul, to vote against that 2002 resolution giving the Bush administration permission to unleash those dogs of war. In the Senate, Paul Wellstone and 20 other Democrats joined with the sole Republican, Lincoln Chafee, to vote no. During the 2002 hearing on Iraq, in which our now President, Joe Biden, urged us to do something about Saddam Hussein's possession of these weapons of mass destruction, a Minnesota senator by the name of Paul Wellstone asked the committee to grapple with pressing questions. He said, and I quote, "What is the precedent for the U.S. to launch a major military operation in the absence of a direct provocation by the target country? Should the U.S. action be targeted and covert, or overwhelming and overt? What would we expect the casualties among the U.S. service personnel to be in a potential war in Iraq? And would it be higher, as most experts agree, than in the current war in Afghanistan? Are Americans ready to shoulder that burden now? What would the death toll," he asked us to consider, "be among ordinary, innocent Iraqi civilians?" End quote. Fewer than 3 months later, fewer than 3 months after the Iraq hearing in the Senate, Paul Wellstone, his wife, and one of his 3 children were killed in an airplane crash. It was October 25th, 2002, 2 weeks after he voted against the war authorization, a move he thought would have probably decimated his political career. He and his family were traveling on their way to a funeral. Though a majority of Americans supported taking military action in Iraq, millions refused to be overtaken by appeals to power and to authority and to fear. Coordinated protests against the Iraq War began 6 months before the invasion. September 29, 2002, a few thousand turned out in Washington, D.C. to preemptively protest the Bush administration's bellicose rhetoric toward Iraq. The day before, more than 100,000 people took to the streets of London, while another 100,000 marched in Rome, Italy, against the war. On January 28, 2003, over 100 protests took place in cities across this country, including San Francisco, Seattle, Portland. Too little credit, I think, is given to this global effort to thwart the world's greatest military power from invading another nation. Historically, as you will recall, I think, demonstrations against a war begin when the blood begins to flow. For example, the first large-scale demonstration against the Vietnam War took place in April 1965, more than a month after intensive U.S. bombing began, when at least 12,000 students amassed in front of the White House. By contrast, the peace movement against war with Iraq began months before the bombs dropped and the troops were even deployed. On February 14, 2003, UN inspectors reported that they had not found evidence of the WMD that Joe Biden, that Mitch McConnell, that Condoleezza Rice, that Donald Rumsfeld, that George Bush insisted were there. And the next day, on February 15, 2003, more than 10 million people, 10 million, united in worldwide protests against this looming invasion of Iraq. Citizens of 70 countries gathered in over 700 cities to demand that the United States government reverse its plan to attack Iraq. This was the largest coordinated protest of human beings in the history of human civilization. As many as 1.5 million participated in London's anti-war protest. Protesters marched past Whitehall, Piccadilly Circus, and Hyde Park. The British actor Mark Rylance described his joyous bewilderment at the diversity of the march. He said this, he said, "I thought I was at the wrong march. I did. I thought this must be something else because there were all these families, people with push carts. It's a British thing, I think. With push carts and babies. Had to look it up. And people I never see on these things. And the outpouring of rage from the people, it was so beautiful. Really passionate and eloquent and beautiful. People crying and shouting, end quote. Rylance's account indicates how awe-inspiring this expression and exemplification of peace and human dignity was to behold. For all of the excited cultural gushing over the beauty and awesomeness of masses of men gathered together to do war, to take life, to destroy, we ought to interrogate the comparative absence of climactic celebrations, of cinematic representations, of such astonishing instances of love, potent solidarity. For inspiration and a stretching of our moral imaginations, we need only look to Spain on February 15, when at least 1 million marched through Madrid and even more marched through Barcelona. We might also look to Italy, where as many as 3 million marched against the war in Rome, rallying at St. John Lateran Square. This protest in Rome is considered the largest single gathering of any number of human beings in the history of the world as well. Consider how few of us know about this feat of coordinated human effort, of agency, of love, a gathering not for consumption, not for profit, not to gain status, but for communion and the preservation of life. In 2003, as I mentioned before, I was living in Palm Bay. I was attending college, doing freelance writing for Florida Today, mostly covering music. And I ended up having a conversation with a subject of a news article I was working on. Actually, her name was Mindy Stone. She's a member of the Green Party. And she put it on my radar. She put this Iraq thing on my radar. Hadn't really been thinking about it. And as I dug into it after our phone call, I was particularly disturbed about all the reports I was reading as just a student looking on the internet. The UN reporting that the first to suffer were going to be pregnant women. It was going to be the elderly. It was going to be those who needed to be able to get to the hospital, but the roads would be blocked. The lack of clean water. This was brought even closer home to me because at the time, the mother of my first daughter was pregnant and was expecting to give birth in May of 2003. I also began to learn about the projected civilian casualties. So I was inspired. I decided to organize a little meeting in Brevard County. I made some phone calls, reached out to some people who I thought might be interested for purposes of putting together a little meeting to plan a protest. After making those calls, sending off those emails, we set a meeting for January 26, 2003. This was Super Bowl Sunday, of all days, all right? Not really the best time, and if you know anything about football, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were actually going to be in the Super Bowl. And I would have rather been watching football, to be honest with you, but we understood the urgency of the moment. Everything else had to wait. Sunday was the best day to gather. And to be honest with you, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing at that moment. I'd never organized a protest, hadn't attended a meeting to organize a protest. Excluding the events that my parents brought me to when I was a young child, I had never participated in a political action. And as is often the case in life, I learned on the fly. A small group of us gathered at what is now a defunct place called the Greenhouse Cafe in downtown Melbourne. We introduced ourselves, we shared our concerns about the looming conflict, and we went on to planning a march in our community for March 15. We contacted houses of worship, we sent faxes, that was still a thing, civic groups, local political parties, called people, elected leaders, got college students together. We made flyers, we passed them out at our own, in spite of not everyone being happy to receive those flyers, encouraging them to participate in a peace protest. And on February 15, 2003, about 500,000 people marched in the streets of Melbourne, Florida, a city at the time which had fewer than 80,000, and I don't have to tell you that not a lot of those people were on the same page. We marched to City Hall, and it was unlike anything that had taken place in this community. Our march brought people from all walks of life together. There were high schoolers, there were college students, people from FIT, we had professors, working people, retirees. We were joined by veterans, representatives of different faith traditions, people of varied politics. We had libertarians, we had socialists. We didn't exclude anybody. We didn't ask people to pass some sort of a ideological agenda test. There are people there we wouldn't have agreed with on any number of other issues. But we gathered together in solidarity on that particular cause. World War II veteran George Colburn, who was 77 at the time, told the local newspaper here, Florida Today, that the war was completely unnecessary and the president had not made a sufficient case for invading Iraq. There was a joyous electricity in our coming together to advocate for the most basic of ethical precepts, the preservation of innocent human life, and the insistence that our government be accountable to the governed. Our chants and speeches were filled with passion. We listened to elders in our community describe their efforts to stop the Vietnam War. And to be honest with you, many of them hadn't been active politically the way they were now active at that moment. We talked with our neighbors and people we would have otherwise wordlessly passed by in the local grocery store. We found a strange social space where talk of income and shopping and status was replaced with talk of values, with talk of dreams, with talk of democracy. We made new friends. We developed new insights. We learned some things. And little did we know at the time that others around the world were doing the same. It was the first of many local marches. There were rallies. There were vigils held over the coming years with the aim of promoting awareness of the destructiveness of U.S. militarism and the policies in the Middle East. And though we failed precisely where we wished most to succeed, the movement, the peace movement, spurred significant social changes, efforts on a host of issues. We activated our political agency. We gained knowledge about government and power. We developed community relations that before did not exist. Many of us gained vital political knowledge, came of age in a way. I certainly did. Learned how to do political organizing. And we can get a sense of this, if you will give me a moment, to mention some of the things that happened right here in this county, in Brevard. Now, as you know, this area covers quite a lot of territory. And as you probably also know, the politics were pretty unique, quite, we would say, red. But let's go beyond red and blue and right and left. In Brevard County of the early 2000s, you can get a sense of what things were like by knowing who our main representative was, a guy by the name of Dave Weldon. Weldon was first elected in 1994 as a part of the Republican Revolution, and he was reelected for 6 consecutive terms. During his tenure in office, Weldon voted to ban gay adoptions. He opposed same-sex marriage. He even voted against protecting people from job discrimination based on their sexual orientation. Weldon, who was seeking election in 2024 for a Florida House right here spot, also voted for the authorization of the use of force in Iraq, consistently supported the Bush administration's war effort. In 2007, I was among a very small group of peace activists who finally were able to get an opportunity to meet with this man. And after I brought up to him Reverend Dr. King's contention that a nation that spends more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift risked spiritual death, something he seemed to be very interested in as a committed, convicted Christian, Weldon told us that he thought that defense spending should be higher, and that if it were up to him, he would shut down the Federal Department of Education if we needed more money. Weldon voted for the 2001 Patriot Act. He sought to prevent it from sunsetting. He also advanced anti-abortion positions and led the challenge of the Food and Drug Administration's 2003 approval of the over-the-counter morning after pill. In 2003, the FDA was about to approve it. Weldon's effort helped result in a decade-long delay of that over-the-counter pill for women of all ages, and a 3-year delay on its availability to adult women. Our 2003 peace activism conducted under the simple moniker Patriots for Peace, drew many people who felt disempowered and marginalized in this community. People who had never done more than vote for president participated in marches and rallies and vigils. Many others joined us who had been politically, civically dormant for decades. They made signs. They registered to vote again. They turned to independent media. Some of them gave speeches. They signed petitions. They wrote letters to their editor. They called their elected officials. Some of them met them or hounded them on the outside of their offices. They raised their voice in civic dialogue with friends, with family members, with their neighbors about public policy and local, state, federal government. During the reoccurring vigils that we held for the war dead at what we then called the Peace Corner, it wasn't uncommon for passerby to park in the nearby parking lot and ask us what we were doing and who we were. People who felt left out of democracy discovered a role in civic life beyond just voting for a predetermined candidate. Peace advocates became involved in local elections as candidates, campaigners, and voters. In 2002 and 2004, Dave Weldon won re-election in this county with more than 60% of the vote. In 2006, peace activists helped anti-war veteran Robert Bowman give Weldon his most competitive election in several terms. Bowman garnered 44% of the vote, despite being outspent 6-1, and getting no serious support from the larger Democratic Party apparatus, who really wanted nothing to do with him. And I know because I was his communication director. And Weldon's refusal also to participate in debates. Another peace advocate, I'm sure some of you know, Michelle Passion, succeeded in serving as city council member in Palm Bay for 8 years between 2008 and 2016. But that's not all. The local peace movement helped foster relationships and grassroots networks centered around our shared values. Together, we worked to advocate for gay and lesbian rights, freedom of expression, the separation of church and state, women's reproductive rights. And we rebuffed local policies inhumanely targeting immigrants. In 2004, local peace activists created a new grassroots group called the Space Coast Progressive Alliance, which I'm sure some of you know about. And later worked to bring the independent news program Democracy Now! To the local public radio station here. We conducted public teach-ins about the dangers of the Patriot Act and government surveillance. In 2004, we held one of the region's first public protests, and I mean in Brevard, in support of marriage equality, countering a local rally advocating a ban on same-sex marriage through the federal marriage amendment. In 2006, we joined civil rights leaders in urging the city of Melbourne to rename the prominent Airport Boulevard to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and of course it would take until 2019 before they'd finally do that. Local peace activists helped reform Brevard County's public schools' abstinence-only sex-based curriculum, sex education curriculum in 2007. The peace movement succeeded in stimulating political agency and participation in our local community. And it stands to reason that all of that energy and all of that effort that we saw here locally, that happened all around this world. And so what I want to say to you is there's really so much more to say. But in the first instance, when people tell us that this peace movement failed because it failed to stop the Iraq War, the first thing we need to point out is that does not show the failure of the peace movement. That shows the failure of democratic institutions. That shows the failure of the party elites in both major parties who refuse to listen to the will of 10 million people around the world demanding reason, demanding democracy, demanding basic ethics. And what is more, even if we accomplished nothing, I think that the humanities and our most basic spiritual ethical principles tell us something. Would we rather live in a world where oppression and dehumanization goes unanswered? Are we willing to accept that simply because, even if there is a guarantee of failure, we are better, that we live better lives because we silence our dissent, because we tolerate it? Was John Brown, who died fighting
Slavery, a fool because he didn't calculate the possible risk of death when he was hung after trying to take over a U.S. armory because he could not stomach slavery? Was Susan B. Anthony a fool because she died before women garnered the right to vote? Or is there something more important than the results? Should we focus more on exemplifying our values and less on calculating politically as those in party offices, those whose whole lives revolve around elections would have us do, calculating with utility? Is there something to be said for understanding your deepest values, your commitment to peace, basic principles of moral universality, basic principles of the right of self-defense, of the wrongs of aggressive war? I would suggest to you that the best and most important justification of the peace movement is that when we spoke up and when we said no to war and we said no to elected officials, we said yes to our most cherished principles. And that alone is good.